4.5 billion years ago, there was nothing to see on Earth except water, rocks, and volcanoes. Until about 3.8 billion years ago, when the first single-celled organisms appeared. Single-celled organisms are tiny living beings that consist of only one single cell. Even though single-celled organisms are so small that you can only see them with a microscope, they are real living beings. They can move, eat, grow, and even reproduce. In the warm seas, at hot springs on the ocean floor, the first organic molecules, the building blocks of life, formed about 3.8 billion years ago through chemical reactions. These building blocks assembled into simple cells, so-called single-celled organisms. Exactly how this happened is still not fully known, but scientists believe that heat, pressure, and chemicals created the first building blocks of life. Some of these molecules were able to copy themselves. That was the beginning of life. Over time, these molecules became surrounded by a protective shell. A cell was born. These first living beings were bacteria, without a nucleus, tiny but incredibly important for the further development of life. The emergence of the first animals from single-celled organisms was a long evolutionary process that took place over hundreds of millions of years. Here is a simplified explanation of how it happened. These single-celled organisms lived in the water and were able to divide and live independently. But at some point, some of them began to live together, like in a colony. Then something special began. The cells started to specialize. That means some cells took care of movement, others of eating or growing. This is called multicellularity, and something like animals began to emerge. The first animals were built very simply, like small, soft lumps, perhaps similar to sponges in the sea. But they were alive and had different cells with different tasks. Over many, many millions of years, more and more different animals developed, with eyes, legs, hearts, and brains. Among the first known animals were Dickinsonia. These animals lived about 570 million years ago and looked like a leaf. They ranged from 4 millimeters to 1.40 meters in size, but were only a few millimeters thick. Anomalocaris lived about 541 million years ago, and, with a length of 140 centimeters, was the largest predator of its time. Around 505 million years ago, Opabinia appeared. Opabinia had 5 eyes and a trunk with a grasping claw. They ate other animals and grew to about 7 centimeters in length. Also, about 505 million years ago, deep down in the sea, a tiny animal swam through the water. It was only a few centimeters long, very thin, and looked like a small worm with a fin. Its name was Picaia. Picaia played a special role in evolution. Inside its body, it had a thin, flexible band, a kind of precursor to what we know today as the backbone. And that is exactly why Picaia is considered one of the very first relatives of all animals with a backbone, including the dinosaurs and us humans. From small animals like Picaia, which swam through the primordial seas, ever more astonishing creatures gradually developed. Although Picaia did not yet have a real skeleton, it already had a simple supporting band in its back. This is called a notochord. It helped it move and wriggle through the water. Over time, these animals got better and better. They developed simple eyes, gills for breathing underwater, and even a head with a brain. Some developed a skeleton made of cartilage, like sharks still have today. And this is how, About 530 million years ago, the first vertebrates came into existence. But wait a minute. If the first animals lived in the water and didn't yet have gills, how did they even breathe? Quite simple. Many of these tiny animals were so small and thin that they could absorb oxygen directly through their skin. This is called skin respiration. Because they didn't need lungs or gills, it worked well, as long as they didn't get too big. One of the first was Hycuichthys, a tiny primordial fish, only about 2.5 centimeters long. It had gills, fins, and a small nervous system. Not a real fish like today, but the beginning was made. Later came animals like Milocunmingia and ostracoderms. They already had bony plates for protection and looked like strange mini-fish. Little by little, these animals became faster, smarter, and developed real scales, jaws for biting, and fins for steering. And this is how the first real fish, like we know them today, came into existence about 430 million years ago. For 160 million years, there were only animals that lived in the water, mainly fish and other sea creatures like crabs, trilobites, jellyfish, or worms. The land was empty. No animals, no birds, no dinosaurs, only rocks, volcanoes, and perhaps some algae. But the land was still empty, and before animals could conquer it, plants had to make the first move. About 470 million years ago, from ancestors of green algae, the first tiny plants appeared on land. They looked like moss. These pioneer plants grew in damp, rocky areas close to the water. They had no roots, no leaves, no stems, but they were able to absorb water from the air and convert sunlight into energy. This way, they slowly turned the land green. Over time, the plants became bigger and stronger. Ferns, horsetails, and the first seed plants appeared. Seeds were a breakthrough, because they could germinate on land without the plant, depending on standing water. Some grew several meters tall. They now had real roots, trunks, and vessels to transport water and nutrients. Their roots held the soil in place and made sure that water didn't just run off. This way, barren rocks turned into green wetlands. These plants did something wonderful. They produced oxygen, and not only in the water, but now also on land. They transformed bare rocks into green wetlands, stabilized the soil with roots, and produced oxygen that made the air breathable. But over time, major changes happened. The earth cooled down, it began to rain, and a lot. The rain fell on the rocks, collected in cracks, flowed over the ground, and slowly carved its way through the stone. This is how the first small streams and rivers were formed. Some rivers filled depressions in the ground. These became lakes or ponds. When the water remained there, and it was especially damp, swamps were created. Muddy, mossy areas with lots of water. The first fish lived in the sea, but at some point some dared to move into very shallow coastal areas. There, seawater mixed with rainwater. This is called brackish water. It is not fully salty, but not fresh either. Some fish learned to survive in this mixed water, and then they went even further, into river mouths, where seawater flows into rivers. There, the water was often cooler, clearer, and sometimes even full of insects and small prey animals. Over many millions of years, some fish moved further upstream, far away from the salty sea. They slowly adapted to fresh water and soon lived in rivers, ponds, swamps, and lakes. This is how fresh water eventually was no longer empty, but full of fish. At the edges of these moist landscapes, where water and land meet, the first animals later lived that dared to leave the water. But even before the first vertebrates set foot on land, others were already there, insects and their relatives. The first ancestors of insects lived in the sea, small, armored animals with many legs, similar to today's woodlice or crabs. More than 400 million years ago, the climate began to change. Coastal areas became shallower, and there were more and more damp shoreline zones. Some of these arthropods ventured into these moist areas and slowly developed the ability to breathe air. Their chitin armor, their hard outer shell, protected them from drying out, and their many legs made them agile on uneven ground. Over time, these early land dwellers became the first true primitive wingless insects, small, quick, and perfectly suited for life among plants. At the same time, early arthropods, such as giant millipedes and scorpions, also lived on land, perfectly adapted to life among the plants. Insects were soon found in every habitat and became a food source for many later land vertebrates. At some point, about 370 million years ago, the world changed. In the shallow coastal waters and swamps, life became more difficult for many fish. The water was often warm and low in oxygen, and sometimes ponds simply dried up. But that was exactly the beginning of an incredible transformation. Some fish lived in these shallow waters, in the shore zones, where the water contained very little oxygen. There they began to breathe, not only with their gills, but also through simple lungs. This allowed them to take in oxygen directly from the air when the water was no longer enough. And not only that, their pectoral fins became stronger, strong enough to push themselves through the mud, or even support themselves on rocks. They used their fins not only for swimming, but also for feeling their way and supporting themselves. Slowly, they began to pull themselves out of the water, perhaps to snap at insects or to reach a new pond. Such animals probably lived on the edges of rivers, lakes, or swamps. They were the pioneers of the land. One of these special animals was called Tiktaalik, half fish, half amphibian. It was like a fish, but with some surprises. It had lungs and gills. Its fins had bones that later became arms and legs. It even had a movable neck, so it could lift its head, something no ordinary fish can do. Tiktaalik lived in shallow swamps. When the water became scarce, it crawled out of one pond into the next, perhaps in search of prey or water. Its strong fins helped it do this, almost like arms with elbows. From such animals, the first true amphibians soon developed, meaning animals that could live both in water and on land. One of the first, about 365 million years ago, was Acanthostega. It had 8 fingers on each hand, but it still could not walk well. It rather paddled through the shallow water. Shortly after came Ichthyostega, which could already crawl properly on land, with strong limbs and a sturdy back. These early amphibians breathed with lungs, but still laid their eggs in the water, just like today's frogs or salamanders. The move onto land was therefore a slow process, not a single leap out of the water. It was an adaptation to changing habitats. For millions of years, many animals still moved back and forth between water and land before true land animals emerged. Even today, amphibians still have very thin, moist skin, and their eggs also do not have a hard shell. That is why they must live near water. They always lay their eggs in water so they do not dry out. So, amphibians were the first true land vertebrates. But they had a problem. Their skin was thin and had to remain moist, and their eggs could only survive in water. But then, about 320 million years ago, something completely new evolved. animals with dry, scaly skin, and eggs with a protective shell. The first amniotes, the first land animals with eggs that could also survive on land. Inside these eggs there was a special protective membrane, the amnion, like a little water bubble that kept the baby animal inside the egg moist and safe. Around it formed a hard or leathery shell that protected against drying out and many dangers. Suddenly, animals no longer had to live near rivers or lakes. They could lay their eggs in sand, soil, or between plants, even in the middle of the desert if they wanted. This opened up entirely new habitats for them and made them the true conquerors of the land. From these first amniotes, two great lineages of animals soon arose. One lineage was the sauropsids. The sauropsids later evolved into reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds. The other lineage was the synapsids. They led to the later mammals. The synapsids already had some special features. Only one skull opening behind the eye for stronger jaw muscles, teeth of different shapes, probably a more active metabolism, and still no fur. Thus, almost 300 million years ago, long before the first dinosaurs walked the earth, a mighty hunter roamed the swampy plains, Dimetrodon, reaching up to 4.5 meters in length, with a huge head full of sharp teeth and its striking sail on its back. It was a ruler of its time. This sail consisted of elongated vertebral spines covered by skin. Perhaps Dimetrodon used it to warm up quickly in the morning sun, or to impress rivals and mates. Yet despite its reptile-like appearance, Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It belonged to the synapsids, the ancestors of mammals. In the Permian period, up until about 252 million years ago, the synapsids were the undisputed rulers on land. But that would soon change. Over the next millions of years, both groups became more diverse. But the synapsids, the ancestors of the mammals, remained inconspicuous for a long time. Step by step, they evolved into the first true mammals, which would only conquer the world after the dinosaurs. But the first reptiles were still small and lizard-like. One of them was Hylonomus, an animal about 20 centimeters long that lived in damp forests. It probably fed on insects and hid among ferns and roots. Such animals first lived in the shadow of the large amphibians, but that was soon to change. Over time, the reptiles became more diverse. They adapted to very different habitats and roles. Turtles belong to the oldest reptile groups of all. Their most distant ancestors already lived more than 250 million years ago, but still without the shell we know today. One of these early relatives was Unatosaurus, a reptile with broadened ribs, perhaps a first step toward the shell. The first true turtles did not appear until the late Triassic, about 220 million years ago. That is, after the first dinosaurs, even before a great catastrophe at the end of the Permian wiped out most animals. New reptiles with special abilities had already begun to evolve. These animals had lighter skulls, strong legs, and a sturdy body structure. They belonged to the archosauromorphs, the ancestors of the later archosaurs. Then came the great mass extinction, huge volcanoes, poisonous gases, and a collapse of the food chain made almost all life disappear. The mass extinction at the Permian-Triassic boundary was the largest extinction event in all of Earth's history, much worse than the one that later wiped out the dinosaurs. It happened about 252 million years ago and marked the end for more than 90% of all marine species, and 70% of all land vertebrates also went extinct. The large synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, were hit hard as well. Only small, adaptable synapsids survived, animals that could withstand heat, cold, and food shortages. But in this almost empty world, a new era began, the Triassic. After the great mass extinction, the Earth was hardly recognizable. The seas were empty, many forests had disappeared, and on land it was hot, dry, and barren. Almost all known animals and plants were gone. But in the midst of this desolate world, a few small, resilient species survived. Among them were reptiles adapted to heat, scarce food, and harsh conditions, and the mouse-sized ancestors of mammals. They had probably already developed fur that protected them against the cold. They were nocturnal and lived for more than 160 million years in the shadow of the dinosaurs. There they waited patiently for the moment when they themselves could become the dominant animal group. Within just a few million years, entirely new groups of animals emerged from the surviving reptiles: fast hunters, crocodile-like predators, and agile bird-like runners. Some of these animals already looked like mini dinosaurs. Among them were the archosaurs, who would soon come to rule the earth. Archosaurs, the name means ruling reptiles. And that was no coincidence, because the archosaurs soon became the most powerful animals on land. Archosaurs had features that set them apart from other reptiles and gave them great advantages. Their skulls had extra openings, making them lighter yet still strong. This made the head faster and more flexible. Unlike lizards, whose legs stick out to the sides, many archosaurs had their legs directly under the body, like a horse. This allowed them to run straight and fast. Some archosaurs walked on two legs, freeing their hands for grasping, hunting, or balancing. Some archosaurs laid their eggs in nests and protected their young, something rare among reptiles. From the archosaurs, two major groups evolved that still shape the Earth today. First, the group of the crocodile-like reptiles. These archosaurs developed into powerful, armored predators. Many of them walked on all fours, some even on two legs. Today, only crocodiles remain from this lineage, but in the past, they were far more diverse. Unlike today's sluggish ambush hunters, many of them were swift runners, long-legged, and hunted small animals in open terrain. Terrestrisuchus from the late Triassic was such a sprinter, slim, fast, and agile. Others, like Protosuchus, lived along riverbanks and hunted fish and amphibians. Some spent more time in the water without giving up life on land entirely. This adaptability made the early crocodile-like reptiles successful survivors. The second great lineage were the Ornithodira. From them arose two completely different groups: the dinosaurs, who conquered the land and appeared in all shapes and sizes, and the pterosaurs, their flying relatives who ruled the skies. Maybe this is a good opportunity to explain something. Even though they are often shown together, pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. They did live at the same time and shared common ancestors, but they belonged to their own distinct group, the pterosaurs. The most important difference lies in their body structure. Dinosaurs walked with legs positioned straight under the body, while pterosaurs had very different proportions, adapted for flight. The same applies to prehistoric animals like Dimetrodon, which lived 40 million years before the dinosaurs and is more closely related to mammals than to dinosaurs. Likewise, Mosasaurus, Ichthyosaurus, and Plesiosaurus were not dinosaurs either, but prehistoric marine reptiles. Although they lived at the same time as the dinosaurs, they had different ancestors and a different anatomy. However, from the group of dinosaurs, birds later emerged. Yes, birds are living dinosaurs. The first true lizards then appeared about 240 million years ago. They were quick, had flexible legs, and were able to survive in dry areas. Some of these early lizards lived in trees, others on the ground. From this group, snakes eventually evolved about 100 million years ago during the time of the dinosaurs, reptiles without legs. The first snake-like animals were probably lizards that lived in narrow burrows. Their legs became smaller until they eventually disappeared completely. About 230 million years ago, in the late Triassic, they finally appeared. Out of the shadows of the archosaurs rose a group of animals that would rule the land for the next 160 million years. With fast legs, sharp senses, and bodies built for conquest, they stepped onto the stage, the first dinosaurs.
Sul